Hello and welcome back to another Burial Rites video. Today we're going to be talking about the character Lauga, sometimes referred to as Lauga. Lauga is a very interesting character in the novel, and one that might seem like a minor auxiliary character at times, but in my belief is a really important character that has been included for such an important reason. Now, at the very beginning of the novel, we meet the two sisters from Cornsa. So we meet Lauga and Steina. Lauga being the younger sister, Steina being the older one. Interestingly though, you would be forgiven for mistaking Lauga as the older sister because she definitely is a little bit more put together, seemingly mature from the offset. Right at the very beginning, that's how she is characterized. One of our first interactions that we have with Lauga happens just after they have found out that Agnes is coming to stay at Cornsa, and Steina does not exactly put on the best hospitality for Bjorn Bjondal. And for example, she does not give him coffee because she tried it herself earlier, and she doesn't pull out all of the stops to impress him. Lauga is mortified by this and says, which is my number one quote for today's video, "He'll think us peasants." Steina, of course, replies to this by saying, "We are peasants," which is really interesting. But the fact that Lauga is really concerned with Bjondal's perception of her as being a peasant sets up this idea of her character existing as what I would say is like a personification of the cultural assumptions of the time. Lauga is very fixated on the idea of upholding their social standing, and she even says that at one point, or thinks that at one point in the text. But she does not want to be perceived as a peasant, particularly to a powerful man. That is what the times were like, so that is what people would value at that time. Very much constructing a representation of gender, of class, and all of these rigid expectations that are put on those that are not powerful men at the time. So that's why I think it's a great quote, particularly because it's from the very beginning that this representation is formed. My next quote helps to support this even further, which occurs after Agnes has been staying at Cornsa. We're jumping quite a length in the text, but after Agnes has been at Cornsa, Lauga says to Steina, "We're all marked now, we'll never be married." So this is just one of many instances in which Lauga is communicating through Kent's use of dialogue that she values the idea of marriage above all else, okay? So she really cares about finding her husband and maintaining and fulfilling the expectation of her as a woman in 19th century Iceland. So again, showing us that she very much upholds these cultural assumptions, and again, she is like the personification of the expectations and the norms of the time. Now, obviously, the most interesting thing about Lauga is while she spends majority of the novel, 98% of it, really being against anything that is not considered the norm of 19th century Iceland, particularly when it comes to Agnes, we do start to see a shift that occurs later in the text. And this is not something that comes easy to Lauga. She does not wake up one morning and think, yep, Agnes is a-okay. She goes through this period of animosity between her and her family, and perhaps worsens the tumultuous nature between her relationship with her sister in order to maintain the idea that Agnes is the absolute worst ever. So one thing she says to Steina is, "Steina, in heaven's name, must you always talk about Agnes?" So she's showing us that she is fed up with this discussion about Agnes, and Kent has utilized this side of Lauga's personality to show us that accepting Agnes is not something that has come easy for her. So we get to see this jealous side of Lauga's personality. Later on, she accuses Steina of treating Agnes as more of a sister than she does her, and we see this vulnerable side to her as she starts to realize that everyone around her is accepting Agnes, but she can't because Agnes does not meet her idea of what is expected of her. Agnes is the antithesis of what a 19th century woman should be, and Lauga cannot accept that because of how close she holds the cultural assumptions to her. Now, as the rest of the family at Cornsa open up to Agnes and accept her and provide Agnes with the belonging that she craves, they accept Agnes, Lauga does not. And she even says at one point, am I the only person who sees her for who she is? So this creates this idea of Lauga being an outcast and Lauga being the one that is abnormal, which is very ironic because the reason why she has these views in the first place are because she is going with the crowd. She is not, Lauga is quite conforming in nature, but here we have her being on the outside, which is really interesting. And something that I think is quite interesting is that Steina at so many times is so desperate for Agnes to see that they're the same, and she's always likening herself to Agnes. But realistically, if we're looking at the way in which one may exist outside of the norm, it's Lauga here that perhaps has that shared experience with Agnes, obviously in very, very different ways, but she does not belong with her family at this point, or so she feels. She feels like she is being ousted for Agnes, and she's really upset with this. However, my favorite Lauga quote, so quote number 5, is one word, one name, Agnes. So just moments before Agnes is executed, Lauga calls Agnes Agnes. She says her name, and Agnes is very quick to acknowledge that this is the first time that Lauga has done this. And that is incredibly significant because she is saying her name out loud. And we heard at the very beginning of the text that Margaret grappled with the idea of calling Agnes by her Christian name. And we know that calling somebody their name is a sign of respect. And if you don't respect somebody, you're probably not going to do this, obviously in extreme circumstances. So this shows us that Lauga accepts Agnes, and Lauga is willing to acknowledge and respect and provide Agnes with a little bit of support and perhaps even love. This is hugely, hugely significant because at the start of the text, it felt like that would never be a possibility. And in my interpretation, this is included because Kent is showing us that it is possible to break free of what might be seemingly relentless, rigid expectations and the values and the attitudes and the beliefs, all three of them, of the time that seem so ingrained in some people, particularly Lauga. She is able to put them to the side and to provide Agnes with humanity. So she treats Agnes like a human in her last moments. So Kent is showing us that despite what we might have thought and despite what others may think, it is possible to accept somebody, which I think is really beautiful. And this is very healing for Agnes. And we know that because she doesn't make much sense at the end of the novel. She cannot really hold a conversation. She's not really participating in many conversations, but straight away she acknowledges that Lauga is calling her by her name for the first time. It also shows us that Agnes noticed, that Agnes knew that prior to then, she had not been called Agnes by Lauga. So she cared that Lauga had not yet accepted her, which really characterizes everybody involved there. Finally, whilst it's not a quote, it is a symbol and one of my favorites in the text, and that is the brooch. So we know at the start of the text, Agnes notices the brooch in the Badstaffer, and she picks it up because she's never seen something shiny before, symbolizing wealth, symbolizing success perhaps, but also because it was a communion gift, it's cementing some of those religious values. Now, she picks it up, she's transfixed with it, and then is accused of stealing it. She's a convicted murderess, and at this time, everybody involved thought that she was guilty of said murder, so of course they're going to think she's capable of stealing. That's a pretty messy situation, but it's not really touched on again until the very end of the novel, when Margaret looks to Lauga, and Margaret says to Lauga, "Your brooch." And it says Lauga looks up, her mouth falls open, okay? So she's shocked, she hesitates, but she gets up and hands her mother the brooch. So in the most symbolic way possible, she is the one who hands this brooch to Margaret to give to Agnes to be executed in. That symbolizes the acceptance and the humanity and the belonging and all of those concepts very much represented in this symbolic act. And this is the purpose of the character Lauga, in my opinion, of course, that she exists to show us this exchange happening. And what better way to see that Agnes is afforded a family than through this symbolism and through the quotes that we have just spoken about. So that is why I really like the character Lauga. She's not very nice for most of the text, but she does provide us with so much to analyze and so much that we can talk about. And her contrast between her sister Steina is so interesting. That's all for today. let me know if you have any questions. Have a wonderful day.